Hey everyone, welcome back to another deep dive into the news.
That's right. It's Monday, March 31st, 2025.
And we are bringing you all the biggest stories from yesterday, Sunday, March 30th, so you can start your week off informed and in the know.
You know, it's interesting. Yesterday was a day where we saw some pretty big developments in a couple of different areas.
Definitely.
We had some significant severe weather events in the Midwest. The cybersecurity landscape continues to be kind of a hotbed of activity. And then we had some pretty interesting developments on the geopolitical front as well with former President Trump.
Yeah. Let's jump right into that weather.
Sounds good.
The Michiana region got hit really hard yesterday by some severe storms. We're talking wind gusts of over 80 miles an hour.
Wow, that's some serious wind.
Yeah. And, large hail.
Always a fun addition to the mix.
And they even had at least one confirmed tornado near Sturgis, Michigan.
Oh, wow.
So some really serious weather. And, as you can imagine, with that level of wind and storms, a lot of damage.
Yep.
Trees, power lines down.
Right.
Damage to homes and vehicles across, a pretty wide area of Indiana, Michigan, and Wisconsin.
Yeah, the reports are showing that over 450,000 people are without power across those three states.
That's a huge number. That's going to take a while to get everybody back online.
Absolutely. I mean,
Yeah.
when you have that many people losing power, it affects everything, right? It
Yeah.
affects daily life,
Everything, yeah.
businesses, essential services.
Yeah. You can't keep food cold.
Exactly.
Can't run your heater or AC. I mean, it's really a major disruption.
It is. And it really highlights how much we rely on that stable electrical grid for so many things that we take for granted in our daily lives.
The good news so far, knock on wood,
Yeah.
is that there are no reports of any injuries.
That's great news.
So hopefully everyone is safe and sound, and they can start focusing on the cleanup and getting things back to normal.
Yeah, and it's probably a good sign that the National Weather Service had issued those tornado watches earlier in the day, so people had some time to prepare.
Right. They knew it was coming.
Exactly.
It seems like South Bend, Indiana was particularly hard hit.
Yeah, some of the reports coming out of there are, suggesting significant structural damage. And it sounds like it was a combination of the high winds and also a lot of rainfall.
Yeah. And this wasn't just an isolated event, right?
Right. This is part of a much larger system
Yeah.
that's been moving across the Midwest
Yeah.
and is expected to continue pushing eastward. So folks in, Ohio and other areas further down the line need to be paying attention to the forecast and be prepared.
Absolutely. The other thing that's a concern with this is that temperatures are expected to drop into the 30s overnight. So those 450,000 people without power,
Yeah.
going to be pretty chilly.
That's a big concern, especially for older adults, people with health conditions who might be more vulnerable to the cold.
Right. It's one thing if it's just, a mild inconvenience, but when it starts getting really cold,
Yeah,
that's when things get really serious.
absolutely.
All right, let's shift gears now. Let's talk a little bit about cybersecurity.
Okay.
March 2025 has been a pretty active month in the world of cybersecurity, and I think it's something we all need to pay attention to.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's something that affects everybody.
Right. So much of our lives are online.
Exactly.
We hear about these big breaches and attacks, and, sometimes it feels a little overwhelming,
It can.
but I think it's important to kind of understand what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what were some of the key areas where we saw a lot of activity in cybersecurity this past month?
Well, I think we saw kind of three main buckets of activity. There were some major cyber attacks and data breaches.
Right.
We saw, the emergence of some new and kind of worrying types of threats.
Right.
And then there were also some important updates in how, governments and industries are trying to respond to these challenges.
Okay, so let's dig into those a little bit. Let's
Yeah.
start with the big attacks and the breaches. What were some of the ones that really stood out to you?
So one that was pretty big in the news was the reported breach at Oracle Cloud. And this was pretty significant, potentially over 6 million records stolen, impacting about 140,000 of their customers. And what's concerning about this one is that reports are suggesting that some really sensitive information might have been compromised. Encrypted passwords, keys, the kind of stuff that really, if it gets into the wrong hands, can be pretty devastating.
Yeah, especially for businesses. I mean, that's a lot of customer data.
Right.
And then, people's passwords and things. That's really scary.
It is.
What else was there?
We also saw a pretty worrying trend with malware being disguised as legitimate applications. So there was one example a fake banking app that was circulating through Telegram and was targeting Android users. And, it was designed to steal sensitive financial information.
So basically, people thinking they're downloading a legitimate app,
Right.
putting in all their banking information, and then boom, it's gone.
Exactly. It's, a classic phishing tactic.
Right.
But, people still fall for it.
Yeah, and I think that's a good reminder for everyone. Always be really careful
Absolutely.
about where you're downloading apps from.
Right.
Stick to those official app stores.
Exactly. Don't be clicking on random links,
Right.
especially in messages or emails.
Yeah, another one that caught my eye was a cyber attack on the Ukrainian railway system.
Right.
Given all the geopolitical tensions, it's not really a huge surprise that we're seeing cyber attacks being used.
Yeah, it really highlights how cyber warfare is becoming a bigger part of international conflict.
Yeah, for sure. And I think this also brings up the point that it's not just about, protecting our personal information,
Right.
but it's also about protecting critical infrastructure.
Absolutely. Our power grids, transportation systems, all these things are increasingly reliant on technology,
Right.
and they're all potential targets.
What about internally? I saw something about a breach at GitHub.
Yes, the GitHub Actions breach. That was a pretty significant one because, GitHub is a platform used by tons of software developers around the world.
Right.
And when a platform like that is compromised, it can potentially lead to malicious code being introduced into all sorts of different software projects.
Wow, that's pretty scary.
It is. It really highlights that, the vulnerabilities can exist even in the tools and platforms that the people who are building software use.
Right. So it's like a chain reaction almost.
Exactly.
So beyond those specific breaches, what about new types of threats? Anything emerging in March that we should be aware of?
Well, we saw the continued evolution of ransomware.
Yeah.
And, unfortunately, this is a threat that just keeps getting worse.
Yeah.
We saw new versions employing some pretty aggressive tactics.
Okay.
One example, Medusa ransomware, which has been described as a triple extortion strain.
What does that even mean? Triple extortion.
So traditionally, ransomware works by, encrypting your data and then demanding a ransom to get it back.
Right.
Triple extortion adds some extra layers of pressure on top of that.
Okay.
So not only might they encrypt your data, but they'll also threaten to publicly release any sensitive information they've stolen.
Oh.
Or they might even target the victim's customers or partners,
Wow.
trying to, really pressure them into paying the ransom.
Yeah. So it's like they're attacking on multiple fronts.
Exactly.
It's not just about the data anymore. It's about reputation. It's about relationships with customers.
Exactly. It's getting a lot nastier.
Wow. Anything else on the ransomware front?
Yeah, super black ransomware. This one reportedly exploited some weaknesses in Fortinet firewalls and potentially compromised thousands of devices globally.
So even if you have, security measures in place, they're always finding new ways to get around them.
Right. It really highlights how important it is to keep all of your security software and hardware up to date.
Right. Patching those vulnerabilities as soon as they're found.
Exactly.
We've been talking a lot about kind of the doom and gloom. Were there any positive developments in March?
There were.
Okay.
So the UK National Cybersecurity Center, the NCSC, they reportedly issued a roadmap outlining their plan for transitioning to post-quantum cryptography by the year 2035.
Post-quantum cryptography. That sounds pretty futuristic.
It is. It's basically looking ahead to a time when computers might be powerful enough to break the encryption methods that we use today.
Okay.
So they're working on new, more secure methods to, be prepared for that.
Wow. That's thinking ahead.
Yeah.
Good for them. Switzerland's also taking some action. They have some new legislation that's set to come into effect in April 2025 that will require operators of critical infrastructure to report cyber attacks.
Okay.
And this kind of mandatory reporting can be really helpful because it allows for better information sharing about threats.
Right. So everybody can learn from each other's experiences.
Exactly.
What about notable incidents? Were there any that kind of stood out that weren't necessarily breaches or attacks, but just kind of things that happened? Yeah, there was one that was particularly, I guess embarrassing might be the right word.
Okay.
Reports that some classified military plans were accidentally leaked through a Signal group chat involving some senior U.S. officials.
Wow.
So, really sensitive information, but it seems like it was unintentional.
Just human error.
Yeah, a reminder that, the human element is a critical part of cybersecurity, even of all the technology in the world. Sometimes it's, just a simple mistake that can lead to a big problem.
For sure. What about, I thought something about cryptocurrency.
Yes, a record-breaking amount of cryptocurrency, about $1.5 billion,
Wow.
was stolen in an attack on the exchange Bybit.
That's a huge amount of money.
It is, and it's believed to be linked to North Korea's Lazarus Group.
So state-sponsored cybercrime.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
So I guess if we had to kind of sum up cybersecurity in March, what would you say are the key takeaways?
Well, I think the main takeaway is that, these threats are becoming more sophisticated, they're happening more often, and they have the potential for a really big impact on our lives.
Right.
So it's really important for everyone to be practicing good cyber hygiene.
What does that mean, good cyber hygiene?
Well, it means things like keeping your software up to date. If you use a Chrome browser, make sure it's updated because there was a recent update that patched some vulnerabilities.
Okay.
Be really cautious about clicking links in emails, downloading things from sources you don't trust.
Right.
And then, for businesses and organizations, using a zero trust security approach, which basically means verifying every user and device that's trying to access your network and having really robust network segmentation.
Right.
So that if one part of your network is compromised, it doesn't necessarily mean that the whole thing is going to fall apart.
Gotcha. Good advice.
Yeah.
All right, let's move on to our third big story from yesterday. Former President Trump is taking a very strong stance against Russia. Specifically, he's threatening to impose tariffs on Russian oil exports. This seems like a pretty significant geopolitical move.
It definitely does. It seems like, his stance on Russia might be shifting a bit.
Yeah. What exactly is he saying? What's the threat here?
So he gave an interview with NBC News and basically said he's not happy with Putin, thinks Russia's to blame for the stalled progress in Ukraine, and if he can't reach an agreement with Russia to end the violence, and if he decides Russia's responsible for that, he's going to impose what he called secondary tariffs on Russian oil.
Secondary tariffs.
Yeah, so these wouldn't be directly targeting Russia itself,
Okay.
but rather the countries that are buying their oil.
Okay.
So China, India, some of those major consumers of Russian oil.
Gotcha.
And he said these tariffs could be pretty substantial, maybe 25 to 50%.
Wow.
And he also hinted that any country that buys Russian oil could face restrictions on their own trade dealings with the U.S.
So this is about using economic pressure to influence the situation in Ukraine.
That seems to be the idea, making it more expensive for other countries to buy Russian oil.
Right.
Which, in theory, could hurt Russia's economy and maybe force them to change their behavior.
Right. What do you think prompted this, stronger rhetoric from Trump?
Well, it seems like there's a few things going on. Obviously the situation in Ukraine is still very tense. There were some reports recently about Putin questioning Zelensky's legitimacy and proposing a transitional government,
Right.
which didn't go over well with a lot of people,
No.
Trump included. He called Putin's remarks not heading in the right direction. So I think it's a combination of frustration with the lack of progress in Ukraine and also just, being unhappy with Putin's recent statements.
Yeah, so a bit of a hardening of his stance.
Yeah, that's fair to say.
Trump's relationship with Putin has been a big topic for a long time. So this threat of tariffs is kind of interesting, given their history. What kind of impact could we see if he actually follows through with this?
Well, I think for Russia, it would probably lead to a decrease in revenue from their oil exports,
Right.
which is a big part of their economy.
Yeah.
And then for countries like China and India, they'd have a tough decision to make, right?
Yeah.
Do they want to keep buying cheaper Russian oil and risk, facing penalties from the U.S.? Or do they try and find other sources of oil? And
Right.
on a global scale, this could lead to some big shifts in how oil is traded
Right.
and maybe even affect global oil prices.
So it's something that could have a ripple effect across the whole world.
Absolutely.
It'll be interesting to see how this
Yeah.
plays out. All right, so we've covered a lot of ground today. We talked about the severe weather in the Michiana region, the ongoing challenges in cybersecurity, and former President Trump's threat of tariffs on Russian oil.
Yeah, a lot to think about.
So as we wrap up here from the energy of Las Vegas, I'm just wondering, how do these events, connect to our lives,
That's a great question.
even if we're not directly affected by them?
Yeah, because even though we're talking about, severe weather in the Midwest, cybersecurity, and global politics,
Right.
these are things that can really impact all of us
Yeah.
in different ways.
With the weather, it makes you think about preparedness, right? Are we ready for, more extreme weather events.
Because it's not just a local issue anymore.
Right.
We're seeing these kinds of events happening all over the world.
Yeah, and with cybersecurity, it just underscores the importance of being vigilant, protecting our own information.
Absolutely.
And then with the tariffs, it really makes you think about the interconnectedness of the global economy,
Right.
how decisions made in one part of the world can really have far-reaching consequences.
Absolutely. It's all connected.
So we encourage everyone to, stay informed about these stories, maybe do some of your own research.
Yeah. Keep learning.
Yeah, there's always more to learn and understand.
Absolutely.
All right, well, thanks for joining us for another deep dive into the news.
Thanks for having me.
Stay informed, stay safe, and until next time, from Vegas Viral News.